Hello, everybody. I am Brandy, otherwise known as the Terrific Lady, and welcome to Retro Rewind. And we have a very special guest this evening, David Weiner, who is the writer, director, and producer of In Search of Darkness, a wonderful explorative documentary into the magical world of 80s horror. So, David, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think it is magical. Some people think it's horrific, but I think it's a little more magical than it is horrific. There's lots going on in that decade that informed so much of the movies that we see today. And, you know, from practical effects to the VHS boom, it's just like, it's such a great era for the genre. And of course, that's what we talk about over 3 films. But you know that, and you could probably tell me more about that.
Yeah, I mean, over like, I think it was almost, if I think it correctly, like about almost close to like 20 hours. Maybe, 20 hours.
Well, the first movie is about 4.5 hours. Second movie is about 4.5 hours. And the third movie is with credits is 5 hours and 42 minutes. And so we're probably in the 14-hour range, but with bonus features and all sorts of other stuff and live events that we've been doing, it might seem that we've done 7,000 hours on 80s horror.
Yeah, so we will just put the math aside and just say like a bazillion hours worth of 80s like horror goodness.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely.
It just felt like a warm kind of hug to me, like as I was watching that movie, because like I mentioned, like previously, like before we started recording, that I'm an 80s baby, was born in 82. My mom introduced me to so many 80s horror movies, and even seeing like little nostalgic clips there, like the HBO intro that was on there. I just started laughing because it's like, not like in a bad way, like, oh my God.
That's one of those things. As a kid who grew up, I was a 70s kid and an 80s teen, and one of the absolute joys of making these documentaries is being able to tap little moments of nostalgia that to the uninitiated are just like, oh, okay, so it's an HBO logo, you know, what's important about that. But if you show like the little HBO booklet that was like the mini flimsy TV guide that you could pick your movies and pretty much figure out your week or your month, and then you hear that music, like it's really intense, and even just a piece of that, you're like, you know, immediately transformed into a kid and transported back into that era. And whether it's doing that or you know, throwing in Siskel and Ebert clutching their pearls at the horror of the era, it's one of those things that I think makes it an entertaining watch and an entertaining celebration. And I want to say, because I brought up Siskel and Ebert, I did try and balance the stuff where they did say some nice things, but inevitably it just comes off as they just were not fans of horror at all. But you'd be surprised. They actually did like a bunch of stuff. And, you know, sometimes it's a backhanded compliment, like, you know, Ebert talking about Motel Hell, surprisingly thinks that it could be borderline on genius, not like the trash like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And so, you know, you sort of get a compliment for Motel Hell. But of course, you know, Tobe Hooper's masterpiece is trash. So you can't win.
Yeah. I even remember just like watching, like when I was little, like some of those like Siskel and Ebert like interviews, like, and like their thoughts about movies. So that also brought back a lot of really good memories. And my mom, when she was sitting there watching these, she's rolling her eyes, kind of like, it's like, yeah, I remember like when they were saying all that.
It was an important time because film journalism in newspapers and print and magazine was a very serious business. But in terms of on television as popular culture, you have to remember, or you should be aware, that in the 80s, listen, Entertainment Tonight didn't show up until 1982, I think it was. Wow. And Siskel and Ebert, you know, were just sort of getting up and running, and that kind of informed Entertainment Tonight that people would watch this stuff. And so turning like a whole show, you know, this is way before E, where it was 24/7. turning entertainment into news and looking at the box office every weekend and on Monday to see who won. That was stuff that really was just sort of had its infancy in the 80s and stuff that we're so used to today. Who won the weekend? No one cared about that in the 70s unless you were in the industry reading the trades, like Variety and Hollywood Reporter.
Wow. And you also, I think I remember whenever I was doing like my research on you, you're also like an entertainment writer, and you also work for Entertainment Tonight. So it's kind of cool that you brought up like Entertainment Tonight and talk a little bit about its infancy.
Yeah, Entertainment Tonight. One of the very cool. I worked at Entertainment Tonight for 13 years as a senior editor of ET Online, and I did stuff for the show as well. But you would never see me on the show, but you'd see me on ET Online a lot. But it was very, very cool for me that I was essentially kind of the film editor as well, and or the film movies editor section. But I did my fair share of tabloid journalism and celebrity DUI and marriages and arrests and deaths and all sorts of weirdness. That was the bread and butter. That is the bread and butter of Entertainment Tonight. But they had a vault. They literally called it the vault. If you need some footage, go to the vault, and people would man the vault. And if it was the anniversary of a movie that I thought was notable, I could do a what we would call a vault assault. And I'd say, all right, it's the anniversary of John Carpenter's The Thing. What do we have? Did we go to the premiere? Did we sit down with Kurt Russell or John Carpenter? Did we get fan reactions? Did we do the red carpet? Did we do a set visit? What kind of stuff would they have? And I'd grab whatever I wanted to that we had, and I'd cut some pieces together with footage that no one had seen for decades. And that was like a real perk among many perks at Entertainment Tonight.
And I like how you mentioned how it's like the vault, because that almost kind of reminds me of the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, like where you have like it's kind of like you have the knight who's like guarding like the chamber, for lack of a better word. That's how exactly. That's how I imagine that.
Although no one said when I grabbed stuff, they didn't say you have chosen wisely. They never said that. I don't understand why.
Darn! Like now you need to go back and like make someone say that. Yeah, and it also kind of leads me into an interesting term that you called yourself, a nostalgia curator. I thought that was very fascinating. Like, how do you see yourself as a nostalgia curator? Like, what do you mean
I didn't always see myself as a nostalgia curator. I just saw myself as I love this stuff and I love to talk about this stuff. But as the gray started getting grayer and the glasses came on that I never had before, and the years go by, I came to the realization that there's so much material out there, so much content that a whole younger generation needs curators to tell them what they recommend. Not necessarily what you have to see and what you don't have to see, but when I was at Entertainment Tonight, for example, I would sit next to 20-somethings who were like, I know I have to see Pulp Fiction. I know I have to see Casablanca. I know. Don't say anything. I still haven't seen Star Wars. I'm not really into that kind of stuff. And listen, you can't chastise people for haven't seen everything out there, but there's so much out there that a lot of times people feel overwhelmed and they don't know where to start. So if you're a curator of this stuff, if I'm telling people I recommend this, this, and this in a list, or as a reference to this or a reference to that, or in one of the In Search of Darkness or In Search of Tomorrow movies, which I didn't quite expect, but people use as a letterbox list practically of all the films that they never knew or were reminded of and wanted to see. But at the end of the day, I think people need someone to guide them along. Or I can point to someone like, Tarantino or Guillermo del Toro, who put together lists all the time saying, oh, here's my top 5. I just love these genre films, these cult films, these action films, these, subgenre films. I think it helps quite a bit. I just saw something on the Twitterverse just I think even yesterday or something where people were saying, am I a film snob for liking Casablanca? Weigh in. And I just thought to myself, fundamentally, listen, like what you like and don't care what other people's opinions are of the movie that you like. Just stand by what you like and share the love about why you love it. And don't apologize for any movie, even if it's The Wizard of Oz, what have you. If you haven't seen Star Wars, you haven't seen Halloween, you haven't seen whatever the most popular movie is that's come and gone. There's lots out there to choose from. And so encourage people to check it out if they haven't seen it, and encourage them, and don't chastise them even passive aggressively. If they're like, I know, I finally saw it. And they're like, how could you not see that? Just people seem to have enough social anxiety as it is. Don't add movies and entertainment as something to have anxiety about.
Yeah, exactly. And also on the flip side, like people I always like see on Twitter, like especially when it comes to horror movies, like, oh, this is my guilty pleasure. And I'm just like, I want to put my foot down and go, no, no, I hate the term guilty pleasure. If you like it, why should you feel guilty about it?
Yeah, or just the gatekeeping
Mhm.
elements. I thought a great example was Stranger Things. Has the most recent season had Kate Bush and running up that hill, and I've been a Kate Bush fan ever since college. But I have. I was excited that a whole new generation is discovering Kate Bush, but there are a lot of people who were saying, "Oh, I was into it before you, and you don't know it like I do." It's just like, boy, you should just be happy that people are discovering new things, and you should be encouraging about it.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of like one time I saw on Twitter someone that said you have to have seen like this exact number of horror films to even be
To be
considered
a
horror.
fan,
Yeah, it's
right?
like get out of here.
Yeah, well, people like to draw attention to themselves. People like to make them puff themselves up and make themselves feel more important. And there are reasons behind that. And I understand it, but it's not necessarily justified. But at least if you could understand why people do these kinds of things. But at the end of the day, if someone goes out of their way to tell you you're only a fan if, then dismiss it. Moving on. Next.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Plug your ears and just like and ignore them.
There's so much great stuff out there. We should all just be enjoying it. We shouldn't be categorizing it as the haves and the have-nots and the better and the worse. Is it entertaining or is it not entertaining? Like Sam Weinman says at the tail end of In Search of Darkness Part 3. Movies shouldn't be good or bad. Are they entertaining to you or not entertaining? And that should be your criteria and jumping off point for discussion about it. But one person's treasure is another person's trash, and that goes over all mediums.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of like so much out there, like there were so many horror movies that came out in the 80s, and I bet you were like, oh, like I want to cover all of them, but I don't know if I can. It's like what was the criteria of like, okay, I want to choose these movies to talk about and In Search of Darkness.
Well, In Search of Darkness Part 1, we never knew or thought or planned there was going to be a part 2 or a part 3. That really genuinely didn't cross our minds. This whole movie, this whole documentary is the brainchild of Robin Block, the CEO of Creator VC. First, he did In Search of the Last Action Heroes, which was directed by Oliver Harper.
Wow.
And I was a producer on that, but that's their film through and through. And I maybe, I put my name on it and helped it across the gate, with the tiniest little push across the line. But that's their stuff. But while they were doing that, they're like, we got to do this for other genres. And Robin's like, I want to do horror next. And while we were getting that organized, he was already thinking about, sci-fi and that kind of stuff and all sorts of genres and the flexibility of decades and genres, and you can go forever if you have a formula that works. But to answer your question, which I haven't answered yet, is the thing is, when we were doing In Search of Darkness, it was crowdfunded. We didn't even expect it to be a 4-hour film, but the decision that Robin made to go from 1980 to 1989, I wanted to include chapters in between to create some context between our collective vision. All of a sudden we were going way past 4.5 hours. And I was just like, there's a decade here where there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of movies. And if you're very specifically going to go year by year, it's very, very hard to categorize them about what you're going to do and what you're not going to do, especially when you have a world, a global world of horror creativity out there. It's very, very daunting. It's very daunting. So I made a very, very difficult decision for the first one, thinking that this is probably the only shot we've got. Who knows what happens next? Is I'm going to stick with North America and mostly American films. And I figured I've got to do all the heavy hitters, and I'll put in a bunch of tuck in a little eclectic choices here and there, and try to appeal to the broadest audience and try and balance a little bit of what the diehard fans love and want and know, and what people who are new and want to discover, new to horror want to discover. It has to be accessible to them as well. So I ended up doing lots of the heavy hitters. We went out to get about 50 people to sit in front of camera, who are in front of the camera, behind the camera. So whether we got, it was amazing that we got John Carpenter, got Heather Langenkamp, got a variety of amazing people, Joe Dante, Mick Garris, the list goes on, getting in front of this camera. Barbara Crampton and Jeffrey Combs. I mean, it goes on, and I could just stop and just list people. But that lent an amazing credibility to what we were talking about. But it also informed what we were going to pick, because I'm like, well, if I've got Barbara Crampton and Jeffrey Combs, I can't only do Reanimator. I've got to do, From Beyond that they did together afterwards, especially if I have Stuart Gordon. If I have Stuart Gordon, not only do I have him talk about those two films, but, to have him talk about Dolls. If I have Brian Usna, who produced these movies and directed his own movie that, most people didn't know unless you were a true, bona fide horror nut, and that's Society at the tail end. You got to do Society. So I kind of balanced that, and I also included lots of. It's a very long answer, isn't it? I chose a lot of heavy hitters and eclectic things, but I also wanted to make sure that I was worried that I was going to get raked over the coals if I didn't go like way into the Friday the 13th sequels and the Halloween sequels and sequels, and get a broader taste of franchises. So that's kind of a long way of saying that I had a lot to think about, and I have a lot of difficult choices to make. And I don't regret anything, because I think by doing this, we enabled ourselves to be able to do a part two. And then when part two was very well received, it really paved the way for a part three. So by this time, we're really doing straight to video, shot on video, international, whether it's Mexican, Asian, Italian horror, so many choices, and there's still hundreds that we haven't even talked about yet.
Yeah, I was just amazed at all the different films that were discussed, because I thought I knew 80s horror. It's like, okay, yeah, I got this. And then I sat down and I watched it. It's like, I have not seen this, and I have not seen that, and I have not seen that, and I have not seen that. It's like, where have I been?
Yeah. It was a wonderful journey of discovery for me, and it was also a big frustration for me too, because I'm a bit of a completist, and I knew that that it's literally not possible to pack it all into one film without so many slipping through the cracks. And some of my personal favorites didn't even make it into part one or part two or part three. But by the time we got to part three, what was really cool, and we did this substantially with part two, was we got the whole horror community who really were involved and really loved these movies, the ones who did, wanted to get involved and wanted to say, next time around, you got to do this movie, you got to do that movie. To the point where we surveyed everybody, we had people write in what they wanted. There was a vote for a top 10. And ultimately, by the time we got to In Search of Darkness 3, everything in that movie, beginning to end, was mentioned by at least some or many people that I didn't even have anything to do with. And I could just cull from this insane list and say, that'll be perfect. I've never even heard of that one. I've got to figure out if that's a good one. Oh, that's great. That's really obscure. Let's do that one. And then it comes back to the casting. And if you have people who are there sitting in front of you, you got to capitalize on that. And put in some of the films that you might not have put in, but they were there and they made these films. And so they have amazing stories and they can walk you through it. And that's sort of the justifier for a lot of the even more crazy and eclectic films.
Yeah, and speaking of just like personal favorites, several of my personal favorites popped up. Of course, John Carpenter's The Thing. If you can see back there, I got the poster of it on my wall, and I was so stoked to see that The Hitcher was in there, because like, oh my god, because I come across people all the time that were like, I've never heard of this movie. I'm like, what? It's like,
and point them to the original versus the remake, in my opinion. But Sean Bean still does a good bad guy.
Yes, he does do good bad guy, and he dies alive. Like in pretty much almost everything he's in. It's really like, it's hard to watch anything he says. Like, is he gonna die? Because I really like the way he plays his character.
They think he needs to make a movie where it's called Sean Bean Doesn't Die in This Movie, and people will go just to see if that's the truth.
Yes, exactly. And then he dies, and they like, ha, gotcha. Damn it. Ed, did any of your personal favorites like make it into that documentary, to make it into In Search of Darkness? I know you said that a few of your personal favorites didn't, but did you have any that did?
Well, absolutely. And most of them made it in the first one. There was one from the second one that I wanted to make sure to get in, and that was Humanoids from the Deep, which I always thought was a crazy movie. That one was for me personally. I saw that when I was really young, when I shouldn't have, and my friend had cable, and we sat down and watched it, and no parents were around, and it's definitely not appropriate, but we loved it and it was great. Among my favorites are like The Hunger, American Werewolf in London. I loved Company of Wolves, so I was so happy to have like Mick Garris talk about that. Lots of werewolf movies. I love The Howling as well. But the thing, they're it's very hard for if you say what's your favorite, I will not single one out, because I feel like all the other ones start crying saying what about me, because I care about them for all different reasons. But I think it was one of the most fun for me was being able to have Tom Atkins, and Creepshow is a big one. I'm just going to keep on saying, and this one, yeah. But having Tom Atkins talk about Halloween 3, and arguably for me, one of the absolute highlights is sitting across from Tom Atkins in his hometown in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and have him sing the Halloween, theme song, happy, happy Halloween, Silver Shamrock, and have him going, it drove us crazy. That to me, there were so many highlights for me, just being able to sit across from my absolute heroes, and being able to pick their brains and to see that they are as enthusiastic about this stuff as we love it. And just to see that they're just down to earth human beings who just love movies themselves, and are enjoying being able to talk about not only that but just the stuff that they love too. And that's I think what is one of the many things that's so special about the In Search of Darkness trilogy now, is not only it's a celebration of 80s horror, but you have all these people who were there who just talk about what they love. Having Felissa Rose, of Sleepaway Camp, just saying, oh, Madman, I have a Madman poster at my home and I love it so much, and it's the greatest, and it's ridiculous, and it's silly. Oh, and I love the Sleepaway Camp sequels that I'm not even in. I wish I was in them, but I love them and I support them. And, it's there's lots of love to go around. And lastly, I'll say about that is I just think that the horror community has lots of love and enthusiasm to give, but we only know that, and our friends and family know that. But the world at large looks at us and thinks that we're all serial killers, and so it's always a bit of an uphill battle when someone doesn't quite understand our genre.
Yeah, it really is, and because sometimes people only know horror because of just like the really gory like kind of entries. It's just like, well, horror is just like a big broad umbrella. There's so many even different subgenres within this big horror umbrella. I mean,
even The Hitcher, when The Hitcher came out, that was positioned as a thriller. because that time things were getting a little slicker and people were trying to get away from slashers, and they just wanted to make it a different kind of create a different kind of perception for box office, and I understand that as well. But horror has always done well at the box office because the fans come out.
Yeah, definitely. Like if you got a horror movie that people love, they will just show up in droves to support. We're awesome. Horror fans are awesome. We're just
Indeed.
awesome people. We'll pat ourselves on the back here.
Yes.
Also, I want to go back to where you mentioned about how you watched that one movie just like a little bit too young.
Yeah,
And
Humanoids from the Deep.
Humanoids from the Deep. It always seems to be that anytime I have talked to somebody, it's always like their first entry into the horror genre is very nostalgic, and it's usually like when they were young. So, for instance, my first entry into the horror genre was I snuck downstairs, sat on the steps, and watched Hellraiser when I was 6.
Wow.
Way too young to be watching something like that. But yeah, was Humanoids from the Deep, was that your first entry to the horror genre, or does it go like even further back?
It literally goes to my childhood before I was 10, but there was a progression. So as far back as I remember, I can't even tell you the first horror movie I watched, but it was Universal horror. It was Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, Wolfman, Creature from the Black Lagoon. Those I loved. Godzilla, that I loved. The more I was glued to the TV, the more I would start seeing Roger Corman stuff and Hammer horror stuff, and starting to understand, wait, that's a little different. Wait a minute, that's Dracula, but that's not the other guy. So who's that guy? Oh, so that guy's Bela Lugosi and that guy's Christopher Lee. Okay, all right, I got it. Oh wait, he plays Frankenstein's monster too. Wait a minute, that's very different. That's a different look. Who do I like better? I would read Famous Monsters of Filmland, and I'd start saying, oh, okay, now I understand that, everyone was doing it. And these go back to books that anyone could have access to. So they would sort of turn these, into franchises for whether it was a studio like Hammer or Universal. But in the 70s, when that was my bread and butter watching that stuff, I was very aware of, even though I was way too young, The Exorcist. I remember people were talking about it, and so I knew about it way before I ever should have ever seen it. Jaws. I wanted to see it. My parents said, "You're too young. You're going to be incredibly, you'll never swim again." So I didn't see those in the theater. The Omen. But then all these things would start coming on TV. First time I saw Jaws was actually after Jaws, I saw Jaws 2 before I saw Jaws. And Jaws came back to theaters. And after I saw Jaws 2 on Martha's Vineyard, mind you, I finally saw Jaws, and, it was amazing. But I remember, I'm getting to a point here, is that I remember in the 70s watching on a tiny little black and white television movies that scared the absolute crap out of me, like The Exorcist, like the Amityville Horror, like The Omen, and like Halloween. And I saw these pretty much, around late 70s. Well, the Amityville Horror came out in 79. Around probably 81, 82, I started seeing this stuff. So I was a tween, when I was seeing this stuff. And my grandmother had knitted this Afghan blanket where the knitting is like big holes, And so I'd watch The Exorcist, and when Reagan would be on, I'd watch right through, peeking through the holes to be protected, Amityville Horror, all that stuff. And I really credit Halloween for really vaulting me into this whole other stratosphere of what a horror movie can be all about. Because The Exorcist was still monsters to me. The Omen and the Amityville Horror was supernatural. And so while that was super cool and a whole other subgenre for me, that still was like unrealistic. if does that make sense to you?
Yes,
But
yes,
then
absolutely.
Halloween comes along, and this is just an unreasonable guy who doesn't say a word, who goes around killing everybody with a knife. That's kind of it. But it was relentless and frightening, and it could happen in the house next door to me. And I was so scared watching that movie by myself. I don't know why I was watching it by myself, that I took it upon myself to want to watch it again and again and again, to be less and less scared, to kind of deconstruct my fear and to understand what was scaring me. What are the tricks that this guy, John Carpenter, was pulling to scare the crap out of me and everybody else? And I was like, all right, the music, I see the music is building up and relentless here. The camera angle, they're shooting in the dark, it's a POV, all these things are contributing to scary stuff, to the point where I wasn't really scared anymore. And I wanted to just keep on watching it because I was obsessed with the filmmaking aspect. And then the next one after that, American Werewolf in London. And that was something where I was like, who is Rick Baker and can he be my best friend? Because I was just like, oh my gosh, I believe this is all happening. And how do they pull it off? And I remember I think it was a Life magazine, big article about the making of American Werewolf in London. And I just devoured that thing until it was dog-eared. I'm like, oh my God, they changed the shape of David Naughton as he's transforming by putting him half in the floor and giving him fake legs. I never would have thought that. Well, my God. Anyway, that's a very long answer in terms of how I ultimately evolved from just loving Godzilla and famous monsters and all those kinds of black and white films and so on and so forth, to becoming a more mature, not only a more mature horror appreciator, but really wanting to dive into how any of this stuff was made. Learning the names of Tom Savini and Dick Smith and Rick Baker and Rob Bottin, and just really diving into this, graduating from Famous Monsters to Fangoria magazine, all that stuff, seeing The Shining and yeah, anyway.
I loved how you mentioned that horror is almost a way for us to deconstruct our fear and in a way almost help us to face our fears head on. As I felt that point was really hammered home across In Search of Darkness. And that was something that I really appreciated.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I went to film school, and so I'm very into the craft of filmmaking. I'm very into the making of and the behind the scenes tales and things that might seem mundane but were important to the cast and the crew, or the epiphanies that they had on set based on low to no budget, so they had to be resourceful and they came up with this, and now it's iconic. That kind of thing. Even Evil Dead 2, Sam Raimi. I saw Evil Dead 2 before I saw Evil Dead 1. I found Evil Dead 1 to this day is scarier. Evil Dead 2 is just a roller coaster ride of entertainment for me. And that told me that horror, just like American Werewolf, could be funny as hell. It could be scary, and then it could just turn a corner and be just ridiculous and outrageous, and you're on board with it. And so it really showed me the flexibility, the malleability of the horror genre, and it's all about what you're bringing to the table. What filmmaker wants to make what film, and do they want to excite you? Do they want to scare you? Do they want to scar you for life? Do they want to make you laugh? Do they want to do a hybrid of all of that? And it's such a creative genre, especially in the 80s, mixed with practical effects and amazing talent.
Yeah, for sure. So much creativity going on in 80s horror. And it was just like it was fun. And it still is it's so much fun. You just have a good time and a blast just watching, like, no matter what 80s horror movie that you put on.
It's like a time capsule, really.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the films that I had never seen or I dismissed at the time, just saying, it's not for me. I absolutely relished getting to either return to them so many years later or just watching them fresh and seeing how they really capture a time period that anyone who tries now, it's just trying to mimic it, but it's genuine when you look at it. Whether it's the fashions, whether it's the gender dynamics, whether it's the practical, the type of effects, the music, the locations, the budget, all these things that really just sort of create this irreplaceable time in film history.
So In Search of Darkness really touched on like the physical media aspect, because we've been talking a lot just about the 80s and how it was pretty much the start and the boom like of this whole just like movie at home era, VHS era. And I am seeing like this argument come up all the time. In fact, I recently wrote about it, about how like whole physical media is dead, like it's dead, it's dying, like it's on its last legs. And I was just like, well, no, it's not. It's just like, so where do you stand on that side of the argument? I'm assuming that I saw you shaking your head.
Well, for me, my personal experience is when I having worked at Entertainment Tonight and having been the movies guy there, I had the dream luxury spoil element of having all the studios send me all their physical media. So in the mail every day, each week, I got 1, 2, 5, 20 DVDs and all that kind of stuff like that, which is great, right? It's great. Imagine like you're thirsty, and then so there's a trickle of water, and then there's a stream of water, and then there's a river of water. At a certain point, you're like, I've got way too much. I don't know what to do with it. I'd give away to friends. I kept what I thought I would watch, all that kind of stuff. But I got to a point where so when the convenience of streaming made a lot of sense to me in terms of just literally space in my house. And prior to Entertainment Tonight, I collected a super amount of stuff, but I was not like a killer, I have to have everything collector. In fact, the job made it like, oh, this is great. I can have so many wonderful toys now. But what happened was when Netflix and Netflix came along, and what I thought, like many people, is that, oh, now I just literally have an online digital library between my Apple, iTunes and Netflix. I don't need social media. I don't need social media now.
Yeah,
I don't need physical media. And I started giving some of that stuff away and selling it and that kind of stuff like that. And I absolutely, like so many people, regret it, because what none of us really realized, we all realize this now, is that there's licenses for things that it comes and goes, streaming media, and it's completely unreliable. You look at what's happening to HBO Max right now.
yeah.
It's a travesty. You think, well, they wouldn't get rid of Game of Thrones. Well, guess what? They're going to get rid of Game of Thrones. There's nothing permanent. All this kind of stuff is better on your shelf if you can afford it, and if you have it, keep it, don't sell it. It's that kind of stuff. And so I even vinyl, the return of vinyl, I was like, all right, so there's more DJs now, so people are into vinyl. That's going to be a fad again. Who wants vinyl? Vinyl is outselling everything else now in terms of music, other than digital and online. People want that physical stuff. People want these tangible things in their hands.
Yeah.
So you could just here, the hunger.
Cool.
Right.
Yeah. Oh.
People like to have these things in their hands and go through them. And there's something about the tangible feel of, whether it's a magazine, whether it's a book, whether it's taking a disc, even VHS. VHS is coming back strong as well. People just like that, and they're nostalgic for it. I'm sure cassettes are right around the corner, and we'll go back to 8-track tapes. Who knows if anyone wants to do that. Yeah, well, which brings me to In Search of Darkness, and we're having a flash sale. I'll just throw that in. We could talk a little more about it later, but what's cool about it is, the thing is, In Search of Darkness 1 through 3 is on Shudder right now. It's not going to be on there forever. And you got to take advantage of, if you really, really, really love this stuff. Again, if you could afford it, you got to buy this stuff. You got to borrow it. You got to get a hold of it, because physical media, it lasts a lot longer on your shelf.
It definitely does. And speaking of physical media, which I thought was a travesty whenever I was going flea marketing a couple of years ago, is that someone sold these for like $1 a piece. It's like $1 a piece.
That's not a travesty. That's like a, we all wish for that. Listen, I kid you not. This is a true, no one, I've told this to nobody, out here in California, I don't know if they have them around the country. I think they do, but people have their little lending libraries in their front yard. Do you guys have that at all?
No, no.
Maybe it's a weather thing. We get rain too, but it's trendy for people to put books and other media and stuff like that in front of their house in a box that is called like a little lending library. And you could put back whatever you want. People just want to share their stuff so it doesn't get thrown out. Every time I take a walk in my neighborhood, I privately wish that someone is oblivious and is getting rid of their Halloween 2, Halloween 3, Friday the 13th, first print paperbacks that go for like $200, $300, $500 now because they're out of print. Yeah, so they're when they're out of print, they're incredibly valuable. And it's just the best when you discover someone who just wanted to get rid of it and you're just like, score. $1 Evil Dead, I'll take it now.
Yeah, for me it was just like, hell yeah, but it's just like the person selling, it's like, you didn't even realize what you have.
Well, maybe they do. Maybe they're trying to do a kindness, pay it forward with Evil Dead.
That is true. That is true. A different way to look at it. Just look.
That's right.
The glass.
They're probably oblivious. Pearls before swine. That's what I say.
Yes. So speaking of like physical media and the need to have something on your shelf, In Search of Darkness, you mentioned that of this big like flash sale that's going on.
Yeah.
Talk about it.
Yeah, well, we like part 1 and part 2, part 3, In Search of Darkness was crowdfunded. And now that the original backers have gotten and are continuing to get their media, their physical stuff, their goodies, whether it's a couple posters and they've got digital downloads and stuff like that. And you could, right now we're making it available to everyone, same thing. So now if you want In Search of Darkness 3 or 1 and 2 and 3, and you want to buy a box, and you can get it as a box set, posters, digital downloads, lots of bonus digital extras, the soundtrack, the digital download of the movie. It's cool to have this stuff. And like I said, streaming comes and goes. So it's kind of nice to have it on your shelf, but it only goes until the 11th, April 11th, Tuesday, April 11th. And we have additional stock. So it's while supplies last. So all I could say is that people who sleep on this, I understand if they do. After the 11th, I have no idea when it's going to be available next. It's going to be quite some time, I can tell you that. And this stuff pops up on eBay for a lot of money. And so if you're interested, go to 80shorrordoc.com or go to our socials at 80shorrordoc and on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and get yourself a copy.
Yeah, and I will give it a glowing reviews. Like, you don't need to sleep on this. If you are a fan of 80s horror, definitely get it. Get all 3 parts if you can, because it's the definitive experience.
Well, it's 14 hours. Yeah. It's over 125 talking heads, icons and legends and experts of the industry. It's just it's like a massive encyclopedia / watch list, really, of 80s horror. And I also feel like it's a time capsule. There are people in this who are unfortunately no longer with us. Stuart Gordon, Larry Cohen. These people were of an era that was important 40 years ago, 30 to 40 years ago. And so I think them talking about this and celebrating this era is something that I think is very important. I'm not self-important about it, but I think in terms of capturing this entire decade and basically just like what do they call them these days? Where an audio history? What do they call it now? Oral history.
There you
That's
go.
oral history is sort of like the cool thing to say now. Whenever it's basically just an interview talking about,
Yeah.
the making of something. But it sounds highfalutin, but it really is kind of like an oral history of a decade. 3 to 4 decades ago. So it's pretty cool.
Definitely is. And with that, I think that this is a good place to end our conversation. Sad, but all good things must come to an end, like as they say. And so, David, thank you so very much for actually letting me interview you.
My pleasure. I've enjoyed chatting with you. I love your retro rewind site with the tracking when you go to it. Like it's like a tracking video. I also like the fact that you want to do pause, which is like present stuff, and so you're doing the nostalgia stuff as well as contemporary horror. I think that's cool, and you write for Collider, and you're doing a lot of stuff, which I think is great because we need a lot of voices, who really care about this stuff, sharing your thought process and your opinions and spreading the word. And I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and Crow about In Search of Darkness. I'm glad it meant something to you. I appreciate your support. And I'll even go so far to say as, moving forward after this flash sale, people have been asking what's next. And I've got 2 projects lined up. We're doing In Search of Darkness 90s. We're going to start crowdfunding in the fall, so in October. And prior to that, we're ramping up In Search of Tomorrow, part 2. So if you liked the horror In Search of Darkness 1, 2, and 3, I did In Search of Tomorrow, which is 5 hours talking about 80s sci-fi. And we're now ramping up to do part 2. And we're doing what is called a fan consultation. So you can go to Creator VC's site or our socials at 80s Sci-Fi Doc and go to the link tree and you'll find a fan consultation there, or all of our posts. We're doing links right to it right now. But I've written a synopsis. I've listed about 20 chapters that we could potentially do. We won't be able to do them all, but this is by the fans for the fans. And we really want the second one to be a deep dive into the cult movies we love and the sequels and the franchises we didn't get to in the first one, and more international titles. And I welcome you and everyone to do this fan consultation. All it requires is your brain space and your passion. You fill out a survey, talk about the things you'd like to see in the next movie. If you want to, you could even write on the synopsis and say, I've got a good idea here, or, oh, you should add this movie because it's a really good one. We would love for people to do that. And that's kind of what we're up to right now.
Awesome. Got a lot of good stuff, sounds like, coming down the pipeline. And remember, flash sale for In Search of Darkness. It ends April 11th. So go buy it.
Yeah, go to 80shorrordoc.com or our socials, 80shorrordoc. And Brandy, thank you so much. I really appreciate your interest and support. And it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you.
And it was a pleasure chatting with you as well, sir. I hope you have a fabulous rest of your evening.
You too.
Thank you.